Hi there and welcome. My name is Dr. Tim Gravoy. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm so glad that you're here to show up for your students, especially your students with anxiety, in this session called Understanding Anxiety. And you'll notice that there are some interactive features in our presentation. They're honestly not going to work the same way if you're watching this content on video, but we're still going to stop and pause at some of those interactive slides so we can still honor the intent of them and engage in the same kind of learning throughout. I'm really glad that you're here. I'm really glad that we get to spend this time together. Thank you so much for showing up for your students in this way. Now, as we get started, I always just like to share a few photos to help y'all get to know me a little bit better. So maybe you've been going to some of my sessions for years, or maybe we're just getting to know me right now. But nonetheless, here's just some few new photos from the last couple of weeks or so that I thought might be kind of fun to share. This is our brand new puppy. Her name is Danny. She's beautiful in every way, imperfect, but she is 100% puppy. She is chewing on everything right now, but she is great. She's just super duper duper sweet, and I'm so glad that she's here in our world. This right here is a picture from Valentine's Day, believe it or not. I live here in Tucson, and there's this place called The Rock, and The Rock had this like disco night, which is really neat. This is my friend Enzo. Enzo's birthday also happens to be on Valentine's Day, so it's actually a little bit uncommon for him to get to do anything that's kind of special for him on that day. So it was neat to just to get out and celebrate a little bit. But especially because it's disco. This is my partner LaShawn. LaShawn's grandmother just absolutely loved Donna Summers. Donna Summers was one of her favorite artists, and he has like so many memories of like dancing in the kitchen to Donna Summers songs. And Grandma passed a little bit ago, and so just having the chance to honor Grandma in this way with some disco music was certainly a lot of fun. That's my friend Adam. That's me. That's my partner LaShawn again. This is Enzo's sister Ashley, and this is one of my favorite pictures of the last couple of weeks. This right here is also a picture of Valentine's Day. My partner LaShawn and I, we wanted to have a nice dinner together, like a lot of couples might for Valentine's, but we honestly didn't get our act together until the day of. So you know what? We're ordering steaks. I went to go pick up some steaks and fries, and that's what ended up happening for Valentine's Day. Steaks were yummy. We didn't have to wait in any kind of line. We didn't have to worry about reservations. It was still a perfect day. This right here is a picture of, again, this is my friend Adam again. That's me. That's my partner LaShawn. These are my kids. We're out at a hike at Sabino Canyon. Here in Tucson, we are really, really lucky. We've got a lot of beautiful places that we can get to relatively easily, and it's definitely a lot of fun for us to spend some time outside. And so if that's something that you also enjoy doing, I hope that's something that a connection that we get to make together as well. And this right here is a picture of some just really important journal pages. So I had a birthday a couple weeks ago, and my friend Dakota was supposed to be here for my birthday. Unfortunately, Dakota died a couple of months ago, and so we're all just kind of navigating just a lot of grief right now, just some feelings of loss. But Dakota's family was really nice enough to share his journal. So the idea was, since he was going to come anyway, why not send one of his journals over? And he had like a lot of these journals. He was taking lots of just notes in and just some doodles. It's actually a doodle of my best friend Bert, actually, as a matter of fact. And what was really nice of his family to do was, I was able just to kind of write about what we did that birthday weekend. Dakota was going to be here anyway, and so this was a really nice way for me to be able to share my birthday with him. And so if there's anybody in the call who's also kind of navigating a loss right now, I just want to let you know I'm holding space for you. And if y'all would be so kind as to hold some space for me and for Dakota and his family right now, I'd really appreciate that a ton. So thanks. And so, just a few photos to get to know a little bit about me personally. And I hope to have the chance to get to know you a little bit better throughout this process as well. Now, in the live session, what I'm always going to do is I'm always going to invite us to think about, what's on our mind and on our heart? Because wherever you were at before you clicked play on this video, you might have had a pretty busy day. Or maybe it wasn't so busy. Maybe it was a great day, maybe it was kind of tricky. But whatever was happening was probably different than what we're doing right now. And sometimes it's helpful to just kind of have the chance to check in with ourselves a little bit. So even though we can't really do this in the interactive way with the slides through the video, I would still love for us to just take a chance to pause. And notice what's on our mind and on our heart. It could be that, I forgot to unload the dishwasher. Could be I'm excited about weekend plans. It could be, oh my goodness, I have no idea what I'm doing with my students this week. Whatever it is exactly the right thing to be thinking about or feeling. And I would love for you to just take this moment to pause and consider what might be on your mind and on your heart right now. Similarly, is sometimes it can be helpful to think about, what goal we might have for our time together. So we know we're here to think about, how we can support students with anxiety. Setting that goal and setting that attention sometimes can kind of help us connect to the content just a little bit. And so again, it's an invitation, not an expectation, but it might be a good time to sort of think about, what prompted me to sign up for this workshop in the first place? And now that I'm here, what goal might I have, for the time that I'm going to be spending with this video today? In the live session, I also like to ask, how are we approaching this content? And one way to think about that is, do I have someone in my life that I care about who lives with anxiety? And that might be yes, that might be no, might be no, probably I do. And it doesn't really matter where we're at. The intent of the slide isn't to say, oh, no, yes, actually, if you think no, the truth is, yes, you do know someone who lives with anxiety. That's not the intent of the slide. The intent of the slide is just to think, if somebody in my life that I care about has anxiety, I might be approaching this content slightly differently than someone who doesn't. If somebody probably does, I might be in a different sort of, kind of uncertain space here, whereas I'm thinking about this content. And so wherever you're at with this is exactly the most beautiful, exactly correct place to be. It's just helpful for us to think about. Now, it might be helpful to think about, am I an adult who lives with anxiety? Yes, no, or probably. And I'm not necessarily talking about a diagnosed anxiety disorder, but just as you think about yourself, might there be some times where kind of some excessive worry gets in the way of the normal things that you would like to do? Now, some people, that's a normal day-to-day part of my life. I have a friend that says, no, actually, I really can't relate to this anxiety content. I never really experienced this. For me, I'd have to say, I probably am an adult living with anxiety. I'm also an adult living with diagnosed ADHD, and anxiety tends to be one of those toxic best friends of ADHD, believe it or not. So a lot of times kids with ADHD, the anxiety goes hand in hand with that as well. And I have a hunch that I'm probably an adult living with anxiety for that reason as well. And again, the point of this slide isn't necessarily to think, oh, wow, there's a correct place or a wrong place to be on this continuum. It's just to note that, wherever we're at, we might be approaching this content differently. Now, one of the first and most important things for us to do is just to consider, what is anxiety? So when we think about anxiety, as an issue that might affect learning, we also can think about anxiety as just a normal human emotion that everybody experiences. There's millions of emotions that we experience, and we're not necessarily in charge of them. Our feelings aren't good or bad, and anxiety is one of those feelings, right? It's a very common feeling that all of us are going to have at some point. But when we think about anxiety that rises to the level where we need to think about school-based interventions, we're thinking about fear or worry that is much bigger than the situation necessarily calls for. Now, we got to be really careful here, because for a person experiencing anxiety, the situation really is calling for that level of fear or worry. But most neurotypical people aren't necessarily going to experience fear or worry to the same degree that folks with anxiety are going to do. But not only that, this fear or worry needs to interfere with daily activities, relationships, and overall well-being. So when we think about anxiety that rises to the level that we need to do something about it as school adults, we're thinking about anxiety that interferes with daily activities, relationships, and overall well-being. That I'm not able to engage with the stuff that I'm expected to engage in, where the demands of school are bigger than what I'm able to do because of the fear or worry that I might be experiencing. And one of the things that's really important for us to think about is anxiety is something that is diagnosed in about 10% of youth aged 3 to 17. So when we think about our school-age youth, about 10% of them are going to be eligible for a diagnosis of some kind of anxiety disorder. And that means that just with this 10%, we absolutely have to be ready with some strategies in advance, because we know that sooner or later, some of our students are going to be in this bucket where they're experiencing fear or worry that's interfering with daily activities, with their relationships, and their overall well-being. And we know that this absolutely is going to affect how our students engage our learning. So it's important for us just to know this is a pretty common thing that we experience. So here are some things that we might notice with students with anxiety. We might notice some nervousness, some difficulty concentrating. We might notice that students are avoiding situations that most students can navigate uneventfully. Now, here's the other thing we might notice. You might notice that there's some physical symptoms, like you might notice a racing heart, We might notice some muscle tension. For me, sometimes when I'm starting to feel anxious, I feel it in the back of my neck a lot of times. We might notice insomnia and really having trouble sleeping. Some people with anxiety will talk about like having a persistent stomach ache or a persistent stomach ache that just really feels like it's not going to be going away anytime soon. Sometimes people with anxiety will talk about like sweating. That it's not necessarily hot, but we're sweating because of the nervousness here. And it's important to think about these physical symptoms of anxiety are not fake symptoms. When our students with anxiety are demonstrating these symptoms, they are real things that are happening to them. And this is something that we really do need to take seriously when we think about engaging with our students with anxiety. They're not faking it when they're saying that they have a stomach ache. Now, when we talk about categories of anxiety disorders, I want to talk about this very carefully. I like to talk about these different flavors of anxiety disorders because providing knowledge of what anxiety can look like and how differently it can present from person to person can be very helpful as we think about how we might go about supporting students with anxiety. But one of the things to note is that, yes, we might note that there's 4 different basic kind of flavors of anxiety. And even within that, there's a lot of other different kinds of subtypes of that kind of anxiety here. But as we think about the generalized anxiety, social anxiety, panic attacks, phobias, as we think about those different kinds of anxiety, even having a diagnosis doesn't necessarily let us know what we're supposed to do. It describes some patterns of symptoms that have emerged over time that seem to be similar to other folks, but every human being is a unique individual and their own mystery that's going to unfold for us as we get to know students and figure out what kind of supports they need. So knowing about these things generally can help us think about ways that we can show up for students with anxiety, but we're going to want to be very individualized and highly tailored regardless of the diagnosis. The other thing to note is a lot of times students won't have access to the resources to get a diagnosis for a lot of these symptoms that we might see. And so every single strategy that we talk about today is something that we can put in place right away. We're not going to need anyone's permission or need to collect 6 to 8 weeks of data. When we see these things happening with our students, we can show up for them and provide them the support that they need. All right, so we'll start with generalized anxiety disorder. And so that one is a persistent and excessive worry. And one of the things that we think about with generalized anxiety disorder is that these symptoms are happening more often than not for more than 6 months. So when we think about what it might be like to be a person with generalized anxiety disorder, we're thinking that I'm essentially going to be living with persistent and excessive worry, where my worry is going to be bigger than the situations in life generally call for most people. And it's going to happen more often than not for more than 6 months. I'm going to experience restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, or irritability. I'm going to have muscle tension, stomach issues, and insomnia. Those are things that we can expect when we're living with a generalized anxiety disorder. And whether this is diagnosed or not, a lot of times people can experience these symptoms that are in ways that are called subclinical, meaning they don't quite meet the diagnostic criteria for a generalized anxiety disorder, but they're still there and they still merit support. And so it's still going to help us to know kind of what these things look like so that we can be ready to show up for students when they happen. Another flavor of anxiety disorder is panic disorder. And this panic disorder is a recurring and unexpected panic attack. So I might know that that I am susceptible to having panic attacks, but I'm not necessarily in charge of when it happens. And they're moments of intense fear or discomfort. So what's different about that from like a generalized anxiety disorder, where in the generalized anxiety disorder, I've got this persistent and excessive worry that sort of exists at a low to mid-level throughout my life, and it happens more often than not, most days than not. A panic disorder is, I don't necessarily know when it's going to happen, but every now and then, I'm going to be attacked with a recurring and expected panic attack where I have these moments of intense fear or discomfort, where I might experience sweating, it might be hard to breathe, I might have some trembling, some chest pain, nausea, or dizziness. A really huge fear of losing control or of harm coming to me in some kind of way. Very highly distressing events, but they don't necessarily happen all the time. A specific phobia is another kind of anxiety where you might have a student who has an intense fear of a specific object, situation, or activity. And some examples of phobias that exist are a fear of heights, flying, spiders, injections, or snakes. That anytime I'm in the presence of these particular triggers, I'm going to have some immediate anxiety and panic, and I'm going to avoid triggers at great lengths. because I know for a fact that even just the mention of a snake for folks with a phobia of a snake is already going to start triggering some anxiety without some learned coping mechanisms along the way. So we can think about understanding the spectrum of anxiety disorders in this way. Now, there's a lot of different subtypes of all of these anxiety disorders. There's social anxiety. There's all different kinds of things here. This is just the briefest summary of some of the more common ones. With generalized anxiety, we've had some persistent symptoms. So with generalized anxiety, we absolutely do have some persistent symptoms. In panic disorder and specific phobia, we have persistent symptoms, but in a slightly different way. Folks with those panic disorders and specific phobias aren't necessarily going to be experiencing the worst of their anxiety all the time, but they are aware of the possibility of experiencing it all the time. So in that way, their symptoms can feel very persistent. We'll see that folks with anxiety disorders might avoid certain situations where they know they're likely to feel overwhelmed, where that fear, anxiety, panic, worry, they know it's going to be overwhelming. So they're going to avoid certain situations where they're going to be put into contact with the things that trigger their anxiety. Sometimes with certain anxiety disorders, it can be very unpredictable. Not so much with generalized anxiety disorder, because unfortunately, folks with generalized anxiety disorder are going to be experiencing their symptoms more often than not for just day after day after day. And so so it's different than with a panic disorder, where it is just very unpredictable. We don't necessarily know when a panic attack is coming on. There might be situations that we can know more or less will sometimes trigger a panic attack, but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And it's just not always clear that this specific situation is what's going to do it. And so that can actually make it even more distressing, because we don't really know when it's going to come on. We just know that it might. Now, with a specific phobia, it's both predictable and unpredictable, in the sense of, if I have a phobia of snakes, I know for a fact that if I walk by the reptile house at the zoo, that phobia is going to be triggered. And so I have the opportunity to go to great lengths to avoid that situation, but I'm not necessarily in control of when a snake shows up in my life, not all the time anyway. And so it's important just to know that with a specific phobia, it's kind of predictable. We can do our best to avoid triggers, but we sometimes really can't. And with all three of these, there's going to be some physical symptoms that go along with it. And again, one of the things that's really important is a lot of times we have students who might ask to visit the nurse a lot, or they might talk about physical symptoms in ways that it doesn't make sense that you have this physical symptom, because there's nothing physically going on in your environment that would cause this symptom, but there absolutely is if an anxiety disorder is involved. Now, again, I just want to talk about diagnosis. A lot of times having a diagnosis can open up doors for support for students that not having a diagnosis can make a little bit tricky. But the reason why I share these different flavors of anxiety and talk about different symptoms isn't so that we can start pseudo-diagnosing students, because after all, most of us are not really licensed to do that as school leaders or classroom teachers or folks that work in schools necessarily. The reason why I talk about these different kinds of symptoms and different flavors of anxiety is just so that we're aware of how these symptoms might show up. Having a diagnosis doesn't necessarily help us support students. It just kind of helps us know a little bit about the patterns that might be going on, so we can recognize when something is happening. So it's really less important to think about the specific symptoms and the diagnosis than really thinking about the problems that anxiety can cause and what we can do to support students in solving those problems. So now, as we kind of think about, we've gone through all of the different flavors of anxiety. Well, actually, no, not even close to all of the flavors of anxiety. We have talked about many of the different flavors of anxiety and many symptoms that can show up when anxiety shows up in our students' worlds right now. Often, just knowing what those symptoms are, we can start to infer, what would probably help? So in the live session, all of these show up in these little boxes right here, and we have a chance to talk about them out loud. Wherever you're at watching this video, what I'd like you to do is, if you would, just go take an opportunity, maybe to just ink your thinking a bit. Maybe take out a pen and write down on a Post-it note, just thinking about the symptoms that we've talked about right now, what might help support our students with anxiety? And go ahead and pause the video for a second if you'd like, and then we'll move on to our next bit of content. All right, so we've had a chance to talk about just what anxiety might look like. Now we're going to talk about strategies for supporting students with anxiety. And in typical MTSS fashion, I've divided them into two different categories, universal and targeted. All right. Normally, this is where a presenter would show you a picture of a color-coded triangle to talk about universal and targeted systems of support. I'm not a fan of the triangle. I really don't like it, especially when I talk about PBIS or other kinds of MTSS or RTI initiatives like that. I'm really not a fan of the color-coded triangle at all for a lot of reasons, mainly because it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really talk about schools the way they actually operate or build systems to support in any way that makes sense for me. And another way that I like to think about it is more kind of like a garden, really. That what we're doing when we're thinking about supporting students with anxiety is building out the systems of support that they're going to need ahead of time. So we can think about these universal systems as being like, oh, the raised bed. By raising the bed, we can create looser soil for roots to grow. And it's just going to be better for any kind of plant that we want to plant here. We can make sure it's got good soil. We can make sure it's got some level of water. We can make sure it's got some access to sun, some access to the carbon dioxide it needs to grow, because after all, these are plants. Those are the universal systems of support. They're going to be good for every single organism living in this garden. And so we can think about the universal supports that we'll talk about next as being great for every single student, but our students with anxiety, we're going to have the most to gain from some of these supports. Then right here, we've got this trellis. Now, I love talking about this trellis whenever I talk about check in, check out with PBIS, because I really think that this trellis is a great metaphor for that. So we've got this squash-looking plant right here. And if anyone who's ever grown squash before, here's the thing that you know. Squash loves to climb. Squash is a plant that will spread. It will take over every last bit of space that we've got in the garden if we let it. Now, if I plant this squash without a trellis, and I say, I've got squash, why don't I collect 6 to 8 weeks of data on the squash and see what happens before deciding to build a trellis? We know that makes absolutely no sense. There's no need to wait 6 to 8 weeks to collect data on an issue that is presenting itself right now. If we're having a meeting about the students and about the supports they need, we can assume that there's a problem that we need to solve. And so what makes more sense in my view is to build out these systems of support so that our students that need some supports to climb up and grow the best are going to have what they need. Now, we don't blame the squash plant for needing a trellis. It's a squash plant. It just needs it. And so we give it the trellis it needs because that's what it needs to grow and be its best. But the other thing to think about is when we build this targeted support here, we're also benefiting this little cabbage plant right here. Now, this cabbage absolutely does not need a trellis. I can put on a trellis next to that cabbage as much as I want. It's not going to need it for its support. It doesn't need it to be its best, but it sure does benefit from the shade that's now provided by the squash plant. When we build coherent, comprehensive systems of support that include both universal and targeted strategies for the students that need it, we benefit absolutely everybody. And so this makes much more sense to me than the color-coded triangle that kind of compartmentalizes and color codes our students in ways that I just don't think are equitable. This is a much more holistic, inclusive way of thinking about it. So what are the systems of support? So you've got in the pre-workshop resources a document that looks a little bit like this. The print on the video is probably going to show up a little bit tricky to read. So you're going to want to have this available, or at least just listen to my words as we go through this next little part. So there's just some strategies that are just great for everybody. And how it's laid out is, here's the strategies right here on the left. There's a description of the strategies here. Here's an example of the strategy, a non-example, and an almost but not quite example. And then if you scan that QR code, you'll be able to go to the actual research support for that particular strategy. So the first strategy is mindfulness practice, and that's a universal strategy. So mindfulness is a universal strategy because it's great for kids with anxiety, but it's actually great for every single student at all. Any student at all is going to benefit from some sort of school-wide mindfulness practice, but our students with anxiety are going to have so much more to gain for it. So it's a really great thing for us to do. So here's an example of mindfulness. We might start the day with 3 minutes of mindful breathing as a class. Personally, I might say 3 minutes is a lot of mindfulness. I might actually say, why don't we just do 3 breaths? You can call that mindfulness, but if you got time for 3 minutes, I think that's great. Now, a non-example of mindfulness is telling students to calm down without providing any tools to help them. That's not an example of mindfulness. Or telling students to be mindful without giving them any kind of explicit instruction in what I mean by that necessarily. Now here's the almost but not quite example. only using mindfulness practices after students are already upset. Now, it's great to talk about mindfulness practices in grades 0 to 99, but it makes a lot more sense if we're going to talk about a universal strategy to make this something that we teach universally school-wide at some specific dedicated time so that we absolutely ensure that everybody knows what we're talking about. Because telling students to take deep breaths when they're already worried and upset is not the best time for them to be learning a skill for the very first time. Just cognitively, there's just no space available for that. All right, so the next universal strategy here is a positive school culture. It's another universal strategy. It's creating a school climate where students feel safe, included, and valued. It's an absolutely foundational universal strategy here. An example of that is recognizing positive behaviors consistently and meaningfully throughout the school. Now, that's just one of many, many things that we can do to build a positive school culture, but it is definitely an example of it. A non-example is focusing and relying only on discipline and consequences without recognizing positive behavior. And so it's really hard to teach students to be flexible and adaptable in situations when we are approaching unexpected behavior in very inflexible and non-adaptive kinds of ways ourselves as the school adults. Now, here's an almost but not quite example, and it makes me chuckle a bit because these almost but not quite are like, oh, it's so close, but not necessarily there. But hosting a single event to promote kindness and compassion, but not following up with daily actions. So I love the kindness assemblies. I love the kindness murals. But if we have those things in our schools, but we're not necessarily making them a day-to-day part of the conversations that we have, they're, I don't know, nice looking mural, but that's about it in terms of building a school culture. Another universal strategy is this one we're doing right now, teacher training on anxiety. When we provide actual information on what anxiety is and what we can help, obviously we're increasing the likelihood that we're going to be able to equip each other to show up for students when they're experiencing moments of anxiety. So an example of that is training teachers to identify anxiety and to use supportive strategies, just like we're doing right now. A non-example would be to assume that teachers already know how to handle anxiety without providing training. And a lot of times, we talk to teachers about strategies that they should be doing as though it's something that we've had an opportunity to learn how to do. And it is not anybody's fault if for some reason we haven't been trained to do a thing that we're expected to do. And so ensuring that teachers have adequate training and making that as universal as possible is going to be a really important step in that process. Now, an almost but not quite example of this would be to offer training that focuses on the clinical side of anxiety only without classroom application. So if all we did was just talk about symptoms of anxiety and different diagnoses, that would be almost, but really not quite there in terms of what we're trying to do. Now, these next few rows are going to be about targeted strategies that are going to help support our students with anxiety. This next one is relaxation techniques. We'll talk about this a little bit more briefly because you can Google a million relaxation techniques, but really you're just looking like it's very simple strategies like deep breathing. That could be a really supportive thing here to help students relax. But it's really important that whatever relaxation strategy we choose to teach in our classrooms, that we're teaching this ahead of time, that we're teaching it to every single student without fail ahead of time before we are asking students to use these skills when they're feeling an escalated or intense kind of anxiety in the moment. The next one is peer support programs. I absolutely love peer support programs. Peer support programs, they absolutely just go to crash and burn if we're not very careful about them, though. And I would say that a good example of that is to organize peer-led support groups or mentoring programs. Those can be really good things so long as we're very, very clear about the expectations for what we want the peer mentors to do and how we want folks to participate in those mentor programs for sure. So a non-example of this is really to allow bullying to go unchecked. That would be the biggest non-example of it. But the best almost but not quite example, which is almost worse than doing it at all, is to assign peer helpers without providing any training or structure, without explaining, hey, this is what you're here to do. We have students who might be experiencing anxiety. You've navigated these feelings before successfully, and we're thinking that you could really just be a good, helpful friend who knows how to show up at the right time and maybe step back at the right time. We just think that you're a good person for that. So here's the training program that we're going to do over the next 5 weeks, maybe 1 day a week for the next 5 weeks. And then when you're done with that, we should be ready to do some supervised sessions. And then after that, you can just meet informally with your peer coachee after that. We want to make sure that if we're going to do this, that we're not sending youth out to support other youth, without all the support in the world to do it exactly the right way in the first place. And so that's going to be a very important thing to consider when we implement these things. This next thing is parental involvement. It absolutely matters to have families involved with this. So when we can share, for example, if we're teaching a relaxation technique up here, we may as well share it with families. That, hey, I don't know if this will work for you at home, but we're doing it at school, so maybe give it a try if you want. And then similarly, families can say, hey, we're doing this thing at home that really seems to help. Maybe we could try it at school. Now, that means a whole lot more than inviting parents to come to a meeting about anxiety and then just saying, hey, 1, 2, 3, go. Now we have to do all the things. Now, this non-example here would be like blaming blaming parents for students' anxiety. Like, oh, we're blaming parents for a student not wanting to show up to school, or blaming parents for the student's symptoms of anxiety showing up in ways that make learning tricky, without necessarily offering them resources or support. And of course, that almost but not quite example is going to be communicating strategies to parents, but not checking in to see if they're working or if they're relevant for the family situation. Now, another thing to think about is just what are our active learning techniques? How can we structure learning so that students know what's expected of them versus not really having a good way to process information. And then because sometimes those almost but not quite examples of being overloading students with group work without necessarily clear roles or guidance about how people are supposed to participate in those groups, those can be very anxiety provoking for our kids with anxiety as well. Now, these next two are things that we're going to be talking about in a bit more depth as we get into the next bit of content. But cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy are absolutely important to students with anxiety. And it's one of those things where when it comes down to school-based interventions for students living with anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy techniques and exposure therapy are two of the best tools that we're going to have, assuming that we've put in everything else ahead of time. So all those other universal techniques, if they are there, the next thing to do would be to think about cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy. Now, we didn't go through the examples, non-examples, and almost but not quite, because we're about to go through these particular strategies in depth because they are so important and are probably the two that we haven't necessarily had an opportunity to learn in previous professional development sessions on supporting students with anxiety. So cognitive behavioral therapy is really about thinking about how the way that we think affects the way that we act. So really what we're trying to do here is to become the boss of our brain. Or another way to think about this is we don't actually have to believe everything that we think. And so really what we're trying to do is not necessarily what a counselor or a therapist is trained to do. That kind of cognitive behavioral therapy happens at a much bigger level. What we're doing here is really more of a do-it-yourself cognitive behavioral therapy practice, where we're going to take the elements of cognitive behavioral therapy and put them into practice in ways that are going to be supportive for our students with anxiety. And what I love about this is that every single time we go through this particular session, there are educators everywhere who say, you know what? This was actually really helpful for me too. Now, what we're trying to do here with cognitive behavioral therapy, and if you're looking at the handouts, you're looking at the Be the Boss of Our Brain handout here, is we're trying to spot the tricky thought. The first thing we're trying to do is to learn how to spot the tricky thought. Then we're going to learn how to challenge that tricky thought. And then if we can challenge that tricky thought, often we're able to change our actions as a result of that. So what might that look like? We're going to be the boss of our brain here, and that Be the Boss of Our Brain handout is what we're looking at. Now, what we're looking here at how it's organized is there's clues that we're having a tricky thought. If one of our tricky thoughts falls into one of these kind of categories here, it's a real good clue here that it might be a bit tricky. Now, what's a little bit tricky for me is this idea of an unhelpful thought, because all of these other thoughts down that column seem unhelpful for me, but that's just kind of what we see a lot in the research literature here. So for example, we might see a thought as unhelpful when it leads to distress, anxiety, or discouragement without really offering solutions or ways forward. And so an example of that kind of a thought is, I'll never get this right. We can challenge that thought by asking, is this thought helping me feel better or solve the problem? Now, we can also notice that we're having thoughts that are really feelings, not facts. The description of that is, I feel it, so it must be true. I'm lonely because no one wants to be my friend is a good example of a thought, an unhelpful thought or a tricky thought that's based on feelings, not facts. We can challenge that by thinking, what facts do I have to prove that this thought is true or false? Now, I'm going to go through just a real life example of how this might work. Because right here, this is not meant to be a script. I want to be very clear about that. This is meant to be just a way of thinking about the different ingredients of that do-it-yourself cognitive behavioral therapy process. It's not meant to be a script, and it's certainly not meant to be an invitation for us as school adults to engage in excessive question and answer time when a student is feeling elevated. It's a way for us to think about how can we show up for students in ways that helps them sort of poke around at their own thinking and maybe access some extra information that would be helpful for them in different moments. Some thoughts can feel like extremes, and we see like I use this all or nothing language, like always, never, everybody, or nobody. For example, I always mess up presentations. Are there times when this isn't true? Are there times when I've done well? We might see tricky thoughts that are catastrophizing, where it jumps to the worst case scenario without evidence. If I fail this test, I'll fail the whole class and my whole life will be ruined. Now, this sounds kind of goofy to say, but there are people who sometimes have this kind of thought, and we all kind of do from time to time. But sometimes it's helpful to think, what's the most likely outcome, and how bad would that really be? Mind reading, where we assume that others know we assume to know what others are thinking without proof. They all think I'm dumb. Well, how do I know what others are thinking? Have they said this? Self-blame, where we take full responsibility for something that's outside our control. It's my fault the group didn't finish the project. Was this entirely my responsibility? What factors were outside my control? Perfectionism, where we set unrealistically high standards for ourselves or others. And this might sound like, if I don't get 100%, I failed. Is this standard fair and realistic? Would I expect this standard from somebody else necessarily? Sometimes we can have tricky thoughts that ignore positive evidence, that focus only on negatives while disregarding positives. I keep messing up in the middle of the song. What evidence do I have that contradicts this thought? Do I always mess up in the middle of the song? Sometimes I get it right. Am I getting better? Are these mess ups getting worse? Or honestly, might I be improving a little bit? Self-critical, where we have some really harsh or unfair self-judgments. I'm so stupid for making that mistake. Would I say this to a friend in a similar situation? What might I say instead? Sometimes we have unhelpful thoughts that are a bit vague. They're broad and kind of non-specific, making it really hard to address. I feel off my game today. Okay, well, what part of my game feels off? Now, it's important to really remember when we're thinking about how we might use this particular handout, it's not an invitation to jump in and just interrogate a student, especially when they're feeling kind of elevated. A lot of times when we start to hear some of our students make these thoughts, it can be really helpful to model our own thinking about times where we felt this way first. And that could be a much more useful strategy. So for example, if I hear a student being overly self-critical, where I might hear him say something like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so stupid for making that mistake." You might say, "You know what, Miha? Sometimes I made mistakes that felt kind of dumb to me too, and it felt horrible. I felt kind of dumb when I was making that mistake. But then I realized, you know what? It doesn't really matter. It's not like I exploded or something. I just took the test again next week and I did better." I'm wondering, do you think that you might do better if you had a chance to retake the test? And if we can offer students a way out, a way for students to improve, that's going to be so supportive for students, especially students who experience anxiety, which is another reason why I think students ought to be able to retake tests. If their learning improves, why don't we document that? I think that's the thing we should think about here. And very often that can be a much more helpful first step than saying, "Hey, I want you to think about these questions yourself." Because a lot of times, if we can model that thinking as adults, it makes it easier for students to think, "Oh, I can think that way too," and without necessarily making the focus too much on them in that particular moment. So again, this isn't necessarily meant to be a script. It's just meant to be a way of thinking through, if I have students who are really engaging in some of these tricky thoughts, how can I show up for them in ways to help them poke around this thought a little bit, maybe gather some more data here, maybe give them some more information that's going to help them see a more holistic perspective and realize that, you know what, we've got help. We've got life rafts coming right now. I can grab onto them. We are going to be okay, and I'm going to be okay because I've got adults in my life who are ready to support me. And this is really what this is meant to do, is just using the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy to help students realize that, what you're thinking right now is leading to some very distressing feelings and maybe even some very distressing physical symptoms. But the good news is you don't necessarily have to believe it, especially if it turns out that it's not true. All right. Now, the next thing that can be really helpful for us as educators is to think about exposure therapy. But I want to be very, very careful about what I'm talking about here. I am not talking about the way that I learned how to swim. I learned how to swim when I accidentally fell into the deep end of a pool and had to figure out how to get my head above water. And that is how I discovered how to swim. Now, I know a lot of people who also discovered how to swim by being thrown into the deep end of a pool, either on purpose or on accident. I wouldn't recommend that way of learning how to swim. I think like swim lessons, honestly, with a trusted adult are probably a much better, kinder way to do that. But a lot of times, we go about exposure therapy in schools, thinking that, what, we can't let a student's anxiety prevent them from achieving the goals that school is meant to help them achieve. And I understand that because we certainly want to make sure that our accommodations and interventions and strategies that we provide are helping students achieve more in school. That's the whole point of this conversation and this session, after all. But we can't be, providing exposure to things that are absolutely distressing and causing more harm. And so that's not what we mean by exposure therapy. What we mean is by, we have this goal that we're trying to achieve. What is the next itty bitty smallest, teeniest, tiniest step towards that goal that we can work towards? And let's keep taking those steps. And as we get higher and higher up that ladder of exposure here, we can realize that, oh, I do have skills. I can navigate a whole lot more than maybe I thought I could. Or maybe as I'm learning new skills and realizing I've got a broader capacity to do things I didn't know I could really do before. And so it's not saying that, oh, you know what? You're terrified to speak in front of your peers. Guess what? For the next 10 days, you are giving an oral report in front of your peers. That's absolutely not what we're doing. What we're thinking about is, okay, if speaking in front of peers is part of our standards and what we're trying to work towards, and we are just terrified even at the thought of that idea right now, what are the itty bitty steps that we can take to get there? And here's kind of a goofy, but I think really helpful illustration of that. In the live session, this is going to turn into a word cloud here, but it says the next 4 slides are all graphic images of snakes. How does that make you feel? And what I love about this word cloud is it always reveals a wide range of people's feelings about this particular topic. Some people think, oh, snakes, great. I love snakes. I love reptiles. I have like several of them in my house, as a matter of fact, that I handle every single day. Others are, no. Even just thinking about a snake makes me sick right now. And that is absolutely not where they are. And wherever you're at on the range, I just want to let you know it's perfectly understandable, it's perfectly normal, it's perfectly beautiful. And it's nice to see that there is so much of a range and that we're all not the same person. And so given that all of us are in this same session right now, and all of us are in our same schools and our students are all in the same kind of boat, we've got lots of different kinds of kids, lots of different kinds of colleagues that we're working with. What can we do to create schools that can get our arms around everybody that's in there? And so the next 4 slides are all graphic images of snakes, and it has to do with exposure therapy. So again, when we think about exposure therapy, if I have a student that is very, very anxious about snakes, let's say I'm a 3rd grade teacher and I generally have a class pet of a snake in my classroom, and I know that I've got a student who feels very anxious about snakes, the very first thing that I'm going to do with that student is absolutely not take them to a pit full of rattlesnakes, right? I'm absolutely not going to expose them to something like this. This is far beyond the skill set of even most of us adults. It takes a highly trained, highly qualified expert to deal with a situation like this. This is a kind of a situation that would absolutely outstrip the capabilities of most of us that are going to be on this call, with the exception of maybe some super skilled herpetologist that happens to be watching this video right now. This is not what we mean by exposure therapy. And so here's the thing, though. A lot of times people say, oh, Tim, you're just being goofy and exaggerating here. We don't do this in schools. Yes, we do. We do stuff like this in schools all the time. We do this in schools when we expect students to perform solos in front of the class before they are ready to do that. When we expect them to read aloud when they are not confident in their capacity to read aloud. When we do this, when we expect them to engage in group work, when social anxiety is a diagnosed reason why they have a very hard time engaging in this group work. Very often we think about exposure therapy in schools in this way, where essentially, you know what? You're scared of snakes? Go hang out with some snakes until you're not. And we're going to do that until you're not scared of snakes anymore. And so we don't want to do this, and that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about exposure therapy. Instead, we might start with something like this. Here are some children looking at reptiles behind glass. It's behind glass. It is so clear that there's a separation between them and the snakes that they might be afraid of. Then, once students have managed to figure that situation out, if I'm thinking about my student who might be a little nervous about my pet snake in my classroom, I might be like, oh, okay, you know what? I'm an adult. I'm going to hold the snake. And I might invite you. Hey, would you like to touch the snake? You don't have to. But if you'd like to, I'm going to hold the snake. It's not going to touch you. It's not going to hurt you. I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. And you can touch it gently if you would like to. And that might feel like the next step in that kind of process. And then once students have had a chance to regulate their feelings, regulate the physical symptoms, and sort of build some success around that, I'm going to touch it while my teacher holds the snake, maybe something like this, where, you know what? If you're ready to hold the snake, if this is something that feels right for you, if it feels good for you and you're excited about this, here, why don't you hold the snake? And I'm here to help. If anything happens, you can just hand the snake right back to me, and I'm going to take that snake away. But notice, I'm seeing two other students who don't look as excited as this boy is for holding that snake. It's 100% okay. Nobody's making them do it, which is another important thing to consider. A lot of times, what we are expecting students to do isn't really all that important anyway. And so if we can get to the learning that we want without necessarily triggering anxiety, sometimes we can structure the learning so that it doesn't have to happen. But in certain kinds of unavoidable situations where, hey, in a music class, performing is part of what we learn, it might be unavoidable. And so if you're nervous about performing in front of your class or in front of the school or in front of an audience, we might need to really think through how we can have some exposure therapy here so that those required auditioning is something that every musician knows you're going to have to do. So what can we do to create those tiered experiences that are going to get our students ready to participate in the most effective, healthy, mentally and emotionally, and honestly, even physically safe way to be for our students with anxiety. All right. So here's perhaps an example of that, kind of sticking with the music example. And a lot of times I pick music examples or examples in other content areas just to show that really we need to be thinking about these accommodations and structures and strategies and supports everywhere. So let's say that we have a goal for a student to perform a solo in front of peers because it's part of our music curriculum that everybody needs to do this. But we have a student with a diagnosed reason why that is not going to be possible for them right now. What we can think about is, okay, well, what is that ladder of itty bitty little steps that we can make to do this? Okay, perhaps, hey, you know what, kiddo? Why don't you just play your song one-on-one with the teacher, away from anyone else who might be listening? Now, we have to be careful because for some people, having an audience is kind of insulating. I'm a musician myself and I perform. I'd rather perform for a giant audience rather than just for one person. Performing for one person feels far more intimate and scary for me than performing for everybody. But other people feel the opposite, that having a smaller audience of just trusted people makes them feel safer. So a lot of times if we're not sure which is going to feel safer, we can ask. We always should ask. But let's assume that the student has kind of agreed to this ladder right here. All right, we're going to start with playing one-on-one with the teacher, away from peers. Nobody's recording, no one's evaluating, no one's observing. We're just going to play. Just play for me. The next step is we're going to play one-on-one with the teacher, and the teacher might record on some kind of music recording device, and then we have a chance to just kind of listen to it. I'm going to play one-on-one with the teacher. The teacher records and shares with a trusted peer. Now here's the thing. Trusted peer is not trusted by the teacher. Trusted peer means trusted by the student. So the student gets to pick who that trusted peer is going to be. All right, so we've done that. We've been successful. We've used our skills. Now we're going to record a solo in the practice room. The trusted peer can listen outside. And once we get good at that, might listen inside. All right, great. We've been successful. Now let's record a solo with a group of peers and we can play it for the class. Hey, you just recorded a solo inside the practice room with a group of trusted peers. Now we're going to play that recording for the entire class. We're going to see that nobody in the class is judging you, laughing at you, or shaming you in any kind of way. And anytime anything like that even remotely happened, I'm going to squash that because I'm the teacher and I don't allow that in my classroom here. Once we feel safe with that, we're going to perform it in front of peers when we feel ready. So we see here with exposure therapy, number one, it only works if we have all of those universal strategies in place. when we've got all those other things that are going to be really good at helping managing and regulating emotions as well as regulating physical symptoms of anxiety. When those are in place, exposure therapy can really work very, very well. But it's itty bitty, teeny tiny steps towards a goal. The other thing that makes exposure therapy work is when we are aware of the goal, but we don't really care about the goal that much. And what I mean by that is we definitely want the student to be able to get to some point in their musicianship where they can perform a solo in front of peers. But whether that But whether that happens today or whether that happens any other time doesn't particularly matter. It only matters that we are getting closer towards that goal. So a lot of times what happens is we build these ladders for exposure therapy, and the goal is by the end of semester, student would be able to perform a solo in front of peers. And that's what gets written into the 504 or IEP or something like that, or even just our own informal plan of support for that student. Now, what can happen here is, oh my goodness, the student didn't get to this level of the ladder, therefore we were not successful. We have to stop that kind of thinking, because this is not going to be a linear process. There might be some days where, oh, hey, the student was able to perform in front of peers. But for whatever reason, today, the anxiety ball is rolling right back into town and is rolling over everything, and I'm not necessarily able to do that today. Just because our best performance happened last week doesn't mean our best performance is always going to happen every single day of the week. And that's whether we're talking about a sports team, a music performance, something that's happening in English language arts, whether it's group work in social studies or science. It doesn't matter what we're talking about. This isn't necessarily going to be a linear ladder where students are always going up and down it. We're going to need to think about this as what we're looking for here is growth. And we're looking for the last best performance that we can find here. And that's going to be the important thing to think about when we start designing exposure therapy. All right. Now, when we're thinking about this ladder that we're trying to build to help those incremental, teeny tiny, safe, itty bitty steps that students can work on towards managing their anxiety symptoms, what we want to do is develop the ladder with the student. We definitely don't want it to be like, hey, here are the things that you have to do. Because if we present it that way, all it really is a list of super scary things that seem to be getting worse and worse and worse. But what we can do is if we develop it in collaboration with the student, a lot of times we can just think, hey, you know what? It'd be really, really helpful if we can get towards this goal. We don't have to do it all today. I'll be happy, honestly, if you could just play it by yourself in the practice room. That's all I need you to do. So if we develop this ladder with the student, that's going to be the best thing. But it often helps to have some ideas ahead of time. Because the reality is that if our students knew how to build this ladder and kind of provide their own exposure therapy, they would have just done it themselves. They would have learned to manage all of these situations independently all by themselves. They're going to need us to show up and support them. That's the whole point of us as being the professional adults in the room anyway. So it's helpful if we have some ideas ahead of time, but not that we're presenting it as this list of super scary things that you absolutely must accomplish by the end of semester. Just, it's kind of like a game. Let's see how many of these we manage to check off. And something that we can celebrate every time that we get somewhere with it. So the other thing, so just to share, this is how you can follow me on Instagram. But before I talk about Instagram, I just want to share, we had a chance to talk about just what anxiety is, how it might show up in students. We've got some handouts of strategies for cognitive behavioral therapy that can really be helpful. We just had a chance to talk about exposure therapy quite a bit. I talk about a lot of these things on Instagram as well. I don't get any kind of like bonus if you follow me on Instagram or anything like that. I don't get a blender or anything. I don't make a dime from Instagram. But I do talk about anxiety and ADHD and building inclusive classrooms and wellness in ways that don't make us roll our eyes, that I think would be really supportive. And so if you wanted to follow me on Instagram, you could just scan that QR code and that would be a great way to do it. But the main thing is just thank you so much for being here. Thank you for showing up for your students in this powerful way. It is an absolute honor and a privilege to be here with you. And I cannot wait to hear all of the amazing things that you're able to do and how you can show up for your students. Thanks so much. And until we see each other again, may you have as many opportunities to be as good and generous with yourself as you are with those that you serve.